So this morning, we are starting a new series called Worthy, Breaking Free from Shame. And this is the last series that Aaron and I will be doing together, which is a little bit bittersweet, if I'm honest. And months ago, we sat down to do our sermon planning, and I asked him what he might want to do for our upcoming series as like a final parting words before he goes, before him and his family move up to Seattle. And without hesitation, he replied, shame. I want to speak on shame. And I thought that was so beautiful. Those of you that know Aaron know his heart. And knowing that he's not afraid to talk about something that so many of us are afraid to talk about. And so here we are, wading in the deep end once again, like we do. Apparently, One Church is in the midst of some deep inner work because we have studied the sacred Enneagram, which really caused us to look at our motivations. And if you haven't studied the Enneagram, feel free to talk to me afterwards. That was a fascinating journey in exploring who you are. But we've also explored healing our spiritual wounds. That was a bit heavy. But this really helped us focus on moving past those wounds into having them being healing scars that we can share with others as a gift. And then we discussed moving through painful seasons of transition and what that looks like. And now we'll be discovering and embracing our God-given worth. That's really what we want to focus on with this. Now, since I mentioned the Enneagram, those that are familiar with it, all 9 types will experience shame, because all 9 types equals all of humanity. Everyone will experience shame. But something to take note of if you're into the Enneagram is those that are in the heart or shame triad, which would be types 2, 3, and 4. You're going to be a lot more prone to shame. So if you are in that center, that's you. I'm preaching to the choir because I'm a type 2. And it's interesting because these types, they tend to focus on their own image and how other people perceive them, which often really determines their value and identity and self-worth. It's something to take note of as you're listening to this when it comes to your own spiritual development. And in fact, it's funny because this morning on the way here, I was checking my email, and I subscribed to this Enneagram thought for the day. And my thought for the day says, clearly, type 2, your pride is a compensation for an underlying fear of worthlessness. That nobody really wants you. Whew. Only humility and the knowledge that you are loved. The fact that in your essential self, you are an expression of love will dissolve pride. Awesome. Thanks for the stab right to the heart, Enneagram. And I thought, okay, great. Well, thank you, because this is where we're going this morning. So it's always interesting to me how I work on something, and as I'm working on a message or a talk, that I end up doing so much inner work myself simultaneously. And shame is a doozy for anybody. And when it comes to talking about shame, I tend to get a couple of reactions. I've mentioned it casually in dinner conversations or just with friends. And I get a few people that are so eager to talk about it. And they're like, yes, let's swap our shame stories. Let's go there. They're great. And then others are hesitant because, quite frankly, the shame is far too heavy. Because the shame is far too painful to bear. And then there's others that I would call maybe this third category that feel they don't have shame at all, which is also something very interesting to take note of. Whether temporary shame or deep, toxic shame, we've all landed somewhere on the spectrum of shame, every single one of us. And because of that, because we all land on this spectrum, we're choosing to paint with a broad stroke when talking about this subject. So please know, I know there's all kinds of roots of shame in this, and some of them we're not going to go there this morning. I think those are conversations meant for dear friends, trusted ones, loved ones, therapists. We are going to leave those aside. So it's my hope that no matter where you find yourself on that spectrum this morning, that you can walk away having a sense that you're divinely worthy and that you're certainly not alone. So we all know that warm wash of shame. It's embarrassment, this warm wash, the hot humiliation that hides under our skin. And it knows no boundaries or distinctions when it comes to age, class, gender, race, or sexual orientation. From the corporate CEO that basically feels incompetent to the small child that wets the bed. Shame is universal. According to author and shame researcher Brené Brown, shame is the intensely painful feeling that we are unworthy of love and belonging. If you've ever felt worthlessness, chances are shame is right behind the door. Shame is the culprit. Shame has been called the master emotion because so much of our human experience is filtered through this lens. Feelings of shame create ideas about ourselves that honestly aren't true. In his book, Letting Go of Shame, Ronald Potter Efron states, "People who are ashamed often see themselves as not being good enough, as failing to reach their goals in life. The shamed person thinks she is not as smart as her fellow workers, not as attractive as her mother, not as kind as her partner, and not as interesting as her friends." Now, when we look at shame in that context, we all can see ourselves in that. Shame occurs when we feel inferior to the idealized image of self. The opinions of others are the key to this idealized image. It's what you were told you should be when you should grow up, or it's what you told you shouldn't be. It's how you saw others living around you. It's the Instagram post you see every single day of a certain kind of life that you feel is unattainable, and it acts as a reminder that you're not good enough. And while some people feel shame most commonly in the presence of others, solitary shame isn't that uncommon either. And I love this. Therapist Robert Hilliker quoted, "Shame started as a two-person experience, but as I got older, I learned how to do it all by myself." See, this is the power of shame. It's something that maybe happened to us, someone told us something, and then it's hard for us to let that go. And so we carry that and learn how to do that all by ourselves. But something to understand about shame is it's not the same as guilt. Shame is a focus on self, while guilt is a focus on behavior. Shame essentially says, I am bad, and guilt says, I did something bad. They're vastly different. Shame, I am. Guilt, I did. Which is so different because the motivations then are different. Guilt really causes us to apologize, to seek healing, to repair that wound. Shame causes us to hide. And they end up having us examine who we are and our self-worth. Shame says things like, I'm broken. I'm disgusting. I'm filthy. I'm not good enough. I have to be perfect. I'm insignificant. I'm weak or useless. I'm bad. I'm ugly. I'm worthless. That's shame. Shame calls into the question the very nature of our divine being, and essentially we're asking, am I worthy of love? Or as someone recently asked me, am I worthy of God's love? And I hate that we even have to ask these questions. Are we worthy of being loved by others and by the divine? See, shame is more than just how we feel about ourselves and our self-esteem. When we dig in deeper, shame really creates a spiritual crisis because it disconnects us from our true divine self. It disconnects us from others and from God. Carl Jung called shame the swampland of the soul. And that gives us such vivid imagery. that this shame engulfs us. We drown in this shame. And let's be honest, not a lot of good things live in the swampland, right? We have insects and alligators, and need I say more? Not good places to want to rest in and make home. And the struggle between worth and shame seems to be with us since the earliest moments of mankind. Maybe it's part of our DNA. We see it written in literature and stories throughout history, and one most famously in the Christian faith, told in the creation story in the book of Genesis. From this book, we're often told of original sin, and I guarantee you, whether you subscribe to Christian faith or not, you go, yep, I've heard that story. But yet we're rarely told of original blessing and goodness. That original sin is the belief that humanity is born sinful. But original goodness says that we are born good. It's here that we can find this ancient story of goodness and shame. We first, let me state, have to announce as we dive into Genesis, that Genesis is largely considered Hebrew poetry. Hebrew authors relied on a number of ways to compose scripture. So they used narrative. We've talked about this in the past. They've used narrative, discourse, and poetry. 1 out of every 3 chapters in the Bible is poetry. And poems, as we know, allow us to sort of see ourselves in that story. Poems allow for more expansive thought than just certain ideas. They allow emotion, imagination, and meaning. And the thing with Hebrew poetry, it's interesting. I mentioned this in when we discussed the What is the Bible series, that Hebrew poetry uses parallelism. And it's this concept of rhyming of ideas rather than rhyming of sounds. And they do this frequently, this rhyming of this concept or idea. And it's basically to suggest the emotion of the event, for you to get over and over this emotion of the event, rather than a timeline description of how things occurred. But poetry, I want to add, proposes some problems when we try to read it literally. It can propose some problems for us trying to understand this deeper meaning of maybe what's going on here. From the first chapter, we read of God's creation of the world and the first mention of the blessing of goodness. In Genesis 1, verse 31, it says, God saw all he had made, and it was good. That's the very first thing that we see. Before the rest of the entire poem, that God saw all that he made, and it was very good. And then we read in Genesis 2, the creation of mankind, as God creates Adam and Eve. And we find them hanging out naked like you do in the garden, right? Who does that? And they're hanging out, and we read in Genesis 2, verse 25, that they were naked, but they felt no shame. They weren't embarrassed. They were just who they were in their whole innocent glory. And then after God was finishing creating them, once again there's a proclamation of goodness. So we have goodness mentioned again. And in Genesis 2, verse 31, it says, and God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. Humankind is very good. Continuing on to Genesis 2, 27 through 28, we now see not only are they good, but now they're blessed. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them. Now, there's a lot to unpack in Genesis that we'll probably save for another time. There's so much to unpack. But what I want us to hinge on is that so far we have that God created the universe. In this poem, how these people understood it at this time was that God created the world and the universe and everything in it, and it was good. And then God created people, and they were good. And then in return, God blesses them. It says, you are blessed. And it's a poetic account of goodness, blessing. and the image of God being at the very core of our being. The very core of our being. The Quakers believe that there is that of God in every man. And then there's the Sanskrit phrase, namaste, which essentially, if you follow the trail, is the God in me honors the God in you. That's understanding worthy and blessing of who we were made to be. Brene Brown says, when you get to the place where you understand that love and belonging, your worthiness is a birthright and not something you have to earn, anything is possible. So when you understand that kind of love and belonging, your worthiness is a birthright, which is kind of revolutionary. Your worthiness is a birthright. That's who you were created to be. Our original blessing. But most of us know, if you have been around the Christian faith, most of us know that the Genesis story doesn't end there. And this is where things get interesting. And this is where people end up spending most of their time focusing on. We read of a serpent who presents himself and his seductive arguments to Eve to go against God's commandments, and they disobey God, and they eat of the forbidden fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in Genesis 3, verses 7 through 10, we read, "Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. And so they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. And then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and they hid from the Lord God among the trees in the garden." And then continuing on, "But the Lord God called to the man, 'Where are you?' And man answers, 'I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid. I was naked, so I hid.'" So if you're tracking with me at all, chapter 2, they were naked, but they felt no shame. They weren't afraid of who they were. And then you move along to chapter 3, where they listen to the lies of another. They go against their intrinsic worth, and suddenly they become aware of their own nakedness. And it's interesting that they were suddenly aware, because even a blind man knows that they're naked. You don't have to have your sight to know that you are not clothed. So we get this insight into this poetry, that this is more of symbolism. That this is symbolism that they felt aware in their heart. Nakedness, which is more of a vulnerability and exposure. And then they had this moment of awareness, which you could say guilt. But instead of moving towards healing, they become afraid and they hide. This is the moment of original shame. They were aware, they were afraid, and then they hide. This is exactly the expression of shame. While it's an ancient story, we do the same thing. We do the same thing, whether we are guilty and that guilt then causes shame, or we are innocent and it's somebody else that said something or did something to us. We're then stuck in this shame cycle. In 1872, Charles Darwin conducted a survey of the emotional lives of humans and found that the expressions of shame were universal. In his findings, he discovered that people in all cultures and civilizations globally displayed shame the exact same way, with eyes looking down. And you know what this feels like when you feel a moment of shame, right? Eyes looking down, gaze averted, a lowered head, slack posture. Some of you know it when you see your children. You can see their reaction, but we know it when we feel it in ourselves. This moment of, this shame, avoidance. A word shame, that word avoidance is a word shame is quite familiar with. See, guilt leads us towards in recognizing that you've done something wrong, and it hopefully causes repair. But shame, there's rare instances where shame is good. And psychologists will say there's a few small instances where it's good. But mostly, Shame leads us away. Shame harms us. Shame always causes us to hide. And it isolates us because shame is really rooted in fear. Fear of being rejected, fear of being unworthy or unloved, fear of being left out of the group, fear of being unfriended, fear of offending somebody. The list goes on. Many of us have shame, guilt, pain, and anger attached to things that we've done and experienced. And so this is the next quote. Yes, I was going to say, please put that up. And so we go to great lengths to hide what we have done or what has been done to us. You are as sick as your secrets until you reveal, examine, and unpack the negative emotions attached to these secrets, thoughts, feelings, and experiences. You are held captive by them. This is where Brené Brown's work really comes in, is setting that shame free. So this is all good and nice, but what does it take to actually combat shame? And I think we have a few practical steps that we can offer, but I think shame is something we will always, as creatures and as humans, wrestle with. But the first I would recommend is, 1, be aware. Recognize shame and what triggers it for you. Most of us know. And for those that I've talked to that said I don't have shame, that's a good one to practice. Because a lot of times we have it and we aren't aware. Now, positive self-talk is another good one. Talk to yourself like someone you actually love, right? You are you. You're the person that you wake up with, you go to bed with. You're the person you take with you always. Be good to yourself. And third, reach out to someone you trust, and trust is the key word. That'll be a therapist, a friend, a family member, a leader. And then fourth, tell your story. Because shame cannot survive being spoken. And I'll add a caveat to that where you tell your story is also important, because not everyone deserves to hear your story. Okay, so make sure you do that wisely. I think 3 and 4 kind of go hand in hand. Now, Brené Brown has this quote that says, if you put shame in a petri dish, it needs 3 things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount in a petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. The 2 most powerful words when we're in struggle: me too. This is why I focused on the spiritual wounds, spiritual trauma series, because I got talking to so many of you, and there were so many of you saying, me too, me too, me too. And I thought, yeah, then this ought to be something we can collectively say, me too. Or if you haven't experienced that, be able to walk alongside and say, I'm here with you too. There's power and strength in those 2 simple words, me too. Just hearing and knowing that someone else on this planet feels the same way that you do can offer so much comfort. And with that being said, I'd like to ask at this time, Mindy, Cody, and Jacob to come and join me at this time. It's always interesting when we give a message or talk, it becomes, you can feel free to choose whatever seat, side note. There's a microphone behind, they do that. Microphone behind you. And then there's a microphone behind that chair, Jacob. And you and Mindy can feel free to go ahead and share that microphone. We only had 2. Sorry about that. But you know, the thing that feels a bit antiquated about a sermon, if I'm honest, we should have done that before you sat down, but you're awake now, right? You know, the thing that I always feel feels a little antiquated sometimes with the art of the sermon is it's someone talking at you rather than participatory, which is where I think real growth and knowledge happens. And while I can only offer one perspective and my insights on shame, I want to hear from other folks as well. And so I've asked them to join and share a little bit of their Me Too's, if you will. So I'm going to ask them a few questions, and you guys can feel free to, I've already let them know, but feel free to be as open and vulnerable or not as you want. There is no expectation other than what you want to say. Cody, I'll start with you since you're over here. If you could describe shame and what it feels like to you, what would it be?
I would say that it definitely, what you were quoting earlier, just this feeling of inherently feeling like I'm broken, and that I don't, just so disconnected with myself, and it's so heavy that I can't even show up and, as a dad, as a husband, and yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. It's interesting that even as you say that, you're like this. Did you notice that? You're talking about shame, and there's even this expression, because it's hard to be vulnerable, and being vulnerable can even make us feel shameful. So thank you. Jacob, if you could describe shame, what it feels like to you, what would that be?
Yeah, for me, shame is about feeling like I'm not enough. So I think for myself, it's closely related to my identity. So if I identify as something, and for a long time it was, a good Christian or whatever in the church, not being enough of that is really what was tied to, my shame, my feelings of shame and guilt.
Thank you. I think a lot of people can relate to the not being enough. Mindy, if you could describe what shame feels like to you, what would it be?
Well, my particular version of feeling shame these days is probably different than the shame I would have felt years ago. I think we go through different stages of feeling shame, but these days I feel like sort of the seed of my shame would come from other folks perceiving me and my family as being unsafe or being a little bit dangerous. With the particular road that we're walking now, we've lost a lot of credibility in the eyes of our family and our tribe. So I think people see us as sort of like the cautionary tale family. Like if you don't check all the boxes, this is where you're going to end up.
Thank you for sharing that. There's many Me Too's happening right now. Yes? Cody, have you ever been overly critical of yourself? And what message did that criticism tell you about your self-worth?
Where do I start? Yeah, I think, looking back as I've reflected on these questions that you shared, it's like I picked up this message as a kid that, there were stories of love laced in there, but there was always, and we've spoken about this before, but it always came with a condition. And when I couldn't meet those conditions, sorry. I look back at my teenage years and some of these, mistakes that I would make. I would just like this self-loathing, and just feeling like I had failed so miserably that I was like below the grace of God and what I told God was, and then what God was to me, and just feeling that, and just and our bodies are so intelligent where they'll tell us that something's wrong and something's off, but whether it's a sleep pattern or something you feel here, and and it would just carry so heavy, and just that self-criticizing, and not, again, it just detached me from being able to show up for others in so many ways.
Yeah. Shame, yeah, detachment. That's a good word to describe that. Jacob, have you ever been overly critical of yourself? And what message did that criticism tell you about your self-worth?
Yeah, I think, like I said before, like for me, it was always related to my identity. Mm-hmm. So like as a Latino who grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, I felt like I wasn't Latino enough. As a kid who was like pretty nerdy and like into like comic books and dumb stuff, feeling like I was not man enough, like I was not, fitting into this idea of what masculinity is, because I had like feelings and stuff.
Men aren't supposed to have feelings.
What?
Men aren't supposed to cry.
Yeah, and then so for years I didn't let myself have feelings. I didn't let myself have, that I didn't allow myself to be vulnerable in a lot of ways. And so I put up a lot of different masks. Like I would wear a lot of different selves depending on where I am, because I would think, everybody else is doing X, Y, and Z. I should be doing X, Y, and Z. And when I didn't, I would feel shame, and I'd feel, like you said, like the need to hide, the need to put up those masks. Even now, Cody's crying, Mindy's crying. Should I be crying? Like that shame is just even.
Well, gosh, now I feel shame too. Should I be crying?
I know. No, it's
give it time. We'll be crying.
Okay, I'll get there. But yeah, so for me, the way I dealt with shame was hiding and pretending to be, somebody that wasn't true to how I felt like I really was.
As a side note, up until 3 years ago, Aubrey thought my tear ducts were broken. So
they're not now, and that's good. That's good. That's something that I know Aaron will dive into a lot more when he talks about shame in a couple weeks. And I am so excited to hear that, because that is something that we need to hear more of, that it's good, it's normal, it's healthy, it's wonderful to express your feelings, no matter your gender. Please do. Embrace them. Mindy, as a type 3, have you ever been overly critical of yourself? And what message did that criticism tell you about your self-worth?
Yeah, so when I look back at my teen years, I feel like I actually should have had a lot more shame than I did. I have a couple of pictures, or honestly, like my junior year in high school, I had bangs that looked like a dinner plate. Really. It's phenomenal how hard I could get those bangs. I'm like, where was my shame? No shame. And I just proceeded like I was the bomb. But in more recent years, there's been sort of a hollowing out of some of that confidence that I carried for many years. And I think I underappreciated some of the self-love that I used to have, because I feel like there's been a sort of hollowing out with a lot of self-doubt, a lot of folks just questioning the decisions that we've made as a family. And I think that that sort of self-doubt and asking myself whether we really are making the right choices as a family, as individuals, has sort of brought me to a place of paralysis. That's sort of been where my shame has been leaving me lately, is just not really sure where to go next or what step to take, because it isn't laid out for me like it used to be. I used to have, you take step 1, and then there's step 2, and there's step 3, and it's all laid out in front of you. It's very clear. And now we're having to create our own path. And it requires a lot of wisdom and a lot of self-knowledge and just a lot of knowledge, period. Like, you need to be wise to figure out how to live your life when other people aren't allowed to tell you how to live your life. And so I have been met with a lot of paralysis and not quite sure what to do with my children sometimes, even professionally. And so, yeah, sometimes I feel stuck.
There's certain words that they're key words they're using that I think we will all relate with. The stories will be different, but we'll all relate with how that feels. And it's interesting because when you look at shame and its effects and how we respond, they're naming a few of them: masks, hiding, paralysis. Those are actually shame expressions. And so this is what's beautiful about hearing the different stories, is you hear how all of us handle shame so differently, and we all feel it so strongly. So Cody, how has sharing your story opened up others to sharing theirs as well? Did it create empathy in others?
Yeah, this question, looking back on my life and the community that I grew up in, it seemed like we're talking about how shame thrives in secrecy. When we would show up and get together with my friends, or like in a religious setting, like it seemed like everyone just wanted to present as like, I got my stuff together, I got our family, we're all put together. Like, no one would ever really go there to that, like, hey, like, this is some of the stuff I'm dealing with, and these are some of my flaws or some of my weaknesses. And there weren't a lot of instances that happened. And so, 3 years ago, as we started to go through this faith expansion and deconstruction, and when you start to study this spirituality, and there's this waking up, and then the growing up, and then there's this other one called cleaning up, and it's like, holy crap, I got 36 years, that I haven't been doing any of this cleaning up. And so all of these layers that you have to start to unpack from your life, and to try and do that on your own, and to just, go and sit, which is a huge part of, self-care, I think, is just sitting with ourselves and letting, like, us feel and drop into our hearts and feel what's there. But then when you start to meet people that actually aren't presenting with that mask, and they're like, hey, like when Isaac taught, they're not like just presenting, hey, ta-da, here's the stuff you want to see. Mm-hmm. They're actually like saying, like, here's all of me, right? Can you hold? Can you hold all of me, warts and all, all my flaws? Can you hold this with me? And can we share this and have this reciprocal sharing of stories? And in that sharing, in those just intimate, very sacred and spaces where you find these people that you use that word trust, that you deeply trust, and you can show up for each other, it's like this deep releasing, like this heavy weight's been shed, and it's like this expansive heart. It just feels so healing and just deeply, like, expansive, and like you just want to go shout it to the world that yeah, I can do this. So
I can relate to what you're talking about, the ta-da. And for those that didn't hear this message, a wonderful human named Isaac Archuleta came and spoke. He's a therapist and has done a lot of studying on this very topic and our identity. And he presented how we end up showing the world, this is who I am, and with the other hand behind our back, holding the other parts of ourselves. And I can relate. I can so relate. I feel like most of you probably know a lot of my shame stories. But I can relate to going, I'm good, I'm wonderful, I'm awesome, or to my parents, but I'm this, but I believe this, and hiding, but I'm gay, and I know you'll reject that. And presenting, but I'm this, but I'm really this. And can you handle seeing all of me. And that's the fear, is we are all of it. But we're afraid of what will they do with that when they hear that. And so we hide it. Jacob, how has sharing your story opened up others to share theirs as well?
I think a big thing for me that I've realized recently is whenever I share that I see a therapist, so many people will come to me like, I see a therapist too. I don't know. I think there's definitely almost like a taboo around getting help for mental health that we have in our culture, and I think that for me, when I started to just be open about, my mental health struggles and the issues that I've dealt with, and the things that I've done to to treat that, it helps people to say either, oh, I see a therapist too, or you know what, I've always wanted to see a therapist. But I think for a lot of people, they think you go to a therapist because you're broken, and it's like you have to admit that you're broken, when really, no, you go to a therapist for help, and everybody just needs help, and it's good.
Yes.
Yeah, and so for me, that's a big thing. Talking to other men about how they've dealt with, the feeling of, encountering like toxic masculinity and creating, that masculinity for yourself has opened up, discussions of, we're all struggling with the same things, and we, just hiding it only hurts us, and once we become vulnerable and show like who we are, I've found it's not as scary. Like I used to feel like, oh, if I show who I truly am, people won't like me. And, it turns out I'm a cool person. So like I show who I am and people like me, or they don't, and they're wrong, and they're allowed to be wrong.
Yes. That's some good self-esteem right there.
See, therapy works. Self-esteem works.
It does. It does. Thank you, Jacob. Therapy does work. It gets a bad rap, and I don't know why. You go to the doctor when you're feeling sick. Why would you not seek a therapist or a doctor when you feel like emotionally or mentally you need some assistance? Why wouldn't you? Maybe we need to discuss that more in the future. Mindy, I almost just called you Mandy. I looked at Mandy. Mindy and Mandy, so many similar names here. How has sharing your story opened up others to share theirs as well?
Yeah, well, we've been a little bit vocal about our story on social media with our family and that sort of thing. Our story in a nutshell. My husband and I were born and raised Mormon, and very, very devout leaders of our church. And our daughter came out as bisexual a couple years ago, and really started a new journey for our family, both as her being out and proud, and us being out and proud allies, and really not hiding anything. And she was okay with that, and we're okay with that. And so it's complicated a lot of relationships with us, family relationships, and certainly church relationships with the church members, and then ultimately our relationship with the church, the organization. And so we've shared our stories, and we've been, I think one of the most beautiful things that has come of that is that I feel so much more freedom to express love and an instinct to love the LGBTQ community that I had always felt, but I didn't really feel allowed to show that kind of affection and the desire to be an advocate. And once we opened up our story, I felt like a lot of folks who had been wary of us, and probably wary of us for good reason, started feeling safer around us, and we felt safer around them. And but from the shame context, I feel like one beautiful thing of sharing our journey has been that other folks, and as we share, like, gosh, this has been hard, I got sort of publicly shamed by this person, or somebody sent me like a mean Facebook message warning me that I was going to go to hell, or this sort of thing. And as I would share those experiences with other people who had been through similar things, they helped me recognize that for what it was. Like, oh, they're trying to shame you. Oh, okay. Instead of me internalizing, being like, gosh, I really am bad. I'm a bad mom, or I'm making bad decisions or something. They shared tools with me that helped me frame it and see it for really what it was, And now I'm able to analyze other situations. I'll just give you an example. The other day, I had to go down to ASU and sign my daughter up for a little summer school class. And I was wearing just a regular T-shirt that has a pretty powerful political message on it, because I care about that particular political issue. And as I was going down there to ASU, I was thinking, oh man, I'm going to be around all these parents and all these little kids, and they're going to see this message, and they're going to shame me. They're going to give me a little look like, oh great, we got to deal with one of those kind of parents, And so I took it off. I took off my shirt, and I was going to put on just a regular boring shirt. And then I stopped myself and I'm like, Mindy, that's shame. Well, you're stepping into the shame trap, because I've had these kinds of conversations before. I've read some books. I now have a better vocabulary and I think a better framework for analyzing things. So I put back on the shirt, folks. Which sounds stupid, right? But then I went down to ASU and just this is who I am. You're going to take us for who we are. This is our family. This is who we are. So I think it just gives you a better vocabulary, a better framework for analyzing things that you might otherwise internalize. Then you just sort of see it for what it is.
Mindy, we'll stay on you for a second. I'm throwing this one out there randomly. If you could, in a quick sentence or two, describe, if you could sit down and talk to shame, what would you tell it?
Well, as far as trying to battle shame, I've had to remind myself what my strengths really are and not internalize what these messages what kind of messages have been sent my way. And one thing I've had to do, I'm a very sort of visual person, I'm a list person, and like to have lots of visual reminders of what I'm doing in my life and keep my goals on track or whatever. Number 3 kicking in, I guess. And so one activity our family did to fight against shame when we were feeling it is we sat down one night for dinner and asked every single member of our family to articulate, what are our family values? What values do we embrace? Because our prior religion has sort of framed us or suggested that we really should be feeling pretty crappy about ourselves and our decisions right now. But it was absolutely gorgeous to ask each one of my children, what values do we embrace and do we live every single day? And some of the answers they gave just slapped shame in the face. The words like justice. We care about justice. We weren't very vocal about justice before. We are now. We care about self-care. We want to take care of ourselves and be kind to ourselves and not be bullies to ourselves. We care about humor. We're a pretty funny family. You might be surprised because I'm just up here being like a drag. But our family is one of the goofiest on earth, and it's a family value that we embrace. We really do. And the list went on, and it was gorgeous to be reminded, oh my gosh, we have substantial family values. We are worthy. And if I need a list to remind me, fine, make the list. right? And it's in here. And I carry it with me. So that's what I have done with my children and my husband to fight against shame.
That's great, and I think that deserves thank you. Can we go ahead and show them your support and show them all your support and say thank you for sharing? Thank you, guys. The worship team, you can come up at this time. The worship team can make their way. Sorry, I was talking over clapping. Thank you all for sharing. It's amazing to hear from so many different people what they're facing and what they're going through. And it's amazing how once that's spoken, it's almost like that shame slowly starts to fade away. And it might be an ongoing process, but that's where it starts. We'll go ahead and take time over this next song to just kind of reflect. I'll leave it with, in this moment, in this last song, maybe thinking of what are ways that maybe you too have experienced some shame. And what are some I am statements, some positive I am statements that you can replace those with.